The royal charity gala was meant to be a quiet display of unity, but beneath the glittering chandeliers, whispered tensions and secret schemes simmered, waiting for one unexpected spark to ignite it all. On the surface, the royal family appeared as a polished ensemble, stepping into the grand ballroom with grace and calculated smiles. Dressed in their finest, they moved from table to table, exchanging pleasantries with donors, dignitaries, and the press. This event, announced weeks earlier as a celebration of goodwill, was meant to showcase harmony within the monarchy and reaffirm its devotion to charitable causes. Yet for those who watched closely, the cracks in this glittering façade were impossible to ignore. Camilla had made sure she arrived first, asserting her place at the center of attention, her every move choreographed to signal authority. Guests watched as she steered conversations with precision, her tone brisk but measured, claiming ownership of the evening's agenda. Even the floral arrangements bore her distinct choices, subtle reminders of her control over every detail. She moved through the room with an almost territorial air, ensuring that her speeches, her stories, her narrative dominated the whispers and applause alike. Meanwhile, Prince Louis sat quietly at the royal table, tucked between Catherine and William, his presence largely overlooked by the adults, who assumed he was there to smile on cue and fade into the background. But his eyes told another story. They darted between Camilla's commanding figure and his mother's patient, if strained, composure. Though his lips remained sealed, his small hands fiddled restlessly with the napkin on his lap, his face unreadable yet alert, as though he were already sensing the storm to come. Behind the scenes, the staff murmured among themselves, their voices hushed yet urgent. They spoke of Camilla's strategy to use this gala as a quiet declaration of her power over the family narrative, diminishing Catherine and William's growing popularity without ever saying so outright. They claimed she had ensured all cameras would catch her at the podium tonight, that her words would overshadow the quiet grace Catherine so naturally exuded. It wasn't merely a charity gala anymore, it was a battlefield dressed in velvet and gold. Between the speeches and the silent toasts, the tension thickened. Catherine's smile faltered every now and then, replaced with a fleeting look of hurt, though she quickly masked it again for the flashing cameras. Camilla's words carried a subtle bite when she referred to Catherine as a bright young figure still finding her place, causing guests nearby to glance uncomfortably at one another. William's jaw tightened each time Camilla's gaze lingered too long on Catherine, as though daring her to break composure. But it was Louis who noticed it in every micro-expression, every word edged with rivalry. And while he remained outwardly quiet, a quiet rebellion began to brew within him. The cameras continued their dance around the room, capturing smiles and laughter, but a different kind of electricity pulsed beneath the polished performances. And yet, as the evening unfolded, no one, not even the Queen herself, could have predicted the smallest royal would be the one to tear through her carefully crafted plans. While everyone's eyes were on Camilla and Catherine, Prince Louis sat in silence studying, waiting, his small hands clenched with an intention no one yet suspected. From his place at the end of the royal table, he appeared almost invisible, dwarfed by the grandeur of the room and the imposing figures seated above him. Most of the guests hardly noticed the young prince. To them, he was simply a child expected to smile politely and keep quiet, a decorative presence rather than a participant in the high-stakes dance of royal politics. But to those who looked closely, there was something quietly unsettling about his stillness, something deeper in his gaze that betrayed more than simple observation. Louis watched Camilla closely, his eyes narrowing each time her voice carried across the table, each time her sharp glances darted toward Catherine like knives in the dark. He noticed how she leaned forward when she spoke, claiming the air as though it belonged to her, ensuring that all attention bent her way. He saw how Catherine, though poised and gracious, stiffened when Camilla's words brushed too close to insult, how William's lips pressed into a hard line, as though biting back the words he wanted to say. And each time this happened, Louis's grip on the edge of the table grew tighter, his knuckles whitening with the weight of his emotions. At one point, he caught a fleeting moment between his parents, William, murmuring something to Catherine, her eyes soft but pained as she shook her head. The frustration in their exchange cloaked in the language of royalty, but loud enough for him to hear. Louis sat quietly, his young mind piecing it all together. the unspoken truths forming a story he had suspected for months but never dared to voice aloud. The room around him buzzed with forced laughter and shallow conversation. Yet to him, the evening felt heavy, like the calm before a thunderclap. Several guests remarked later how odd it was that Louis wore such a serious expression, so uncharacteristic for a child his age. Gone was the playful boy they'd seen before. In his place was someone watching, measuring, preparing. Some palace insiders even whispered about how, in recent weeks, he'd been asking unsettling questions of the staff about who really wore the crown, about why his mother's place seemed so fragile, despite the love she inspired. Those questions had been brushed aside then, but now, sitting at that table, the answers glimmered in his quiet fury. And when Camilla rose to speak, her words would unknowingly provoke the storm Louis was holding inside. With the nation's eyes on her, Camilla delivered a speech that glittered with false grace, but one line would cut deep enough to awaken the lion in Louis. As she approached the podium, the applause was polite, measured, almost obligatory, but beneath the surface, there was an unmistakable chill. Some family members clapped with stiff hands, their smiles frozen in place. Others avoided her gaze entirely, their eyes heavy with quiet disapproval. Yet Camilla, either unaware or unbothered, basked in the attention as if it were a crown she'd earned through sheer force of will. Her words began innocuously enough praises for the charities represented, thanks to the donors who had made her vision possible, and acknowledgments of the family members who had shown support in their own ways. But as the speech unfolded, the tone sharpened, each phrase a calculated strike cloaked in velvet. And then came the line that sucked the air from the room. She described Catherine as a bright young figure still finding her place in this grand story, the emphasis lingering just long enough for the implication to sink in. Louis's small shoulders stiffened as the words settled like stones in his chest. Across the table, he could see his mother's expression falter for just a second before she regained her composure. But it was too late. He'd already seen it. He'd already felt it. Camilla's words, disguised as graciousness, were anything but. They were a claim, a warning, a public reminder of where power truly lies. As she continued, Camilla spoke of the gala as her personal vision, her lifelong commitment to service, and her lasting contribution to the monarchy. She spoke as if no one else in the family had breathed life into these causes, as if her hands alone had carried the weight of duty. And with every self-congratulatory word, Louis's jaw grew tighter. The faint murmurs of the crowd became louder in his mind. Uneasy glances exchanged. Strained smiles plastered on faces that knew better than to show discontent. By the time she reached the final lines of her speech, declaring the evening a testament to her unwavering resolve, Louis felt his hands clench into fists beneath the table. Camilla ended with a triumphant smile, stepping back as though she'd just delivered a masterpiece. She didn't notice the boy's steady, piercing gaze fixed on her. She didn't notice the quiet fury she'd stirred awake in the smallest royal. As Camilla stepped back, satisfied, Prince Louis began to rise, and with him, the room's collective breath held tight. No script, no approval. Prince Louis stood, his voice cutting through the stiff silence with a defiance that shook even the oldest walls of the palace. The moment came so abruptly that it took the entire room a full second to register what had just happened. From the far end of the royal table, where he had sat in quiet observation all evening, Louis climbed up onto his chair with deliberate force, his small figure commanding attention like a thunderclap in a chapel. Gasps erupted immediately, some hands flying to mouths, others reaching instinctively to hush the boy, but no one could stop what was already in motion. With a steady gaze fixed squarely on Camilla, Louis raised his voice so that it carried above the murmurs, above the clinking glasses, above the suffocating decorum that had kept him silent for too long. "My mummy is the true queen!" he cried, the words echoing with an unshakable certainty that made the room fall still. The stunned silence that followed was deafening. Guests froze mid-bite, the press cameras, at first too stunned to move, suddenly snapped back to life, shutters firing wildly as they captured history unfolding before their eyes. Catherine's face turned pale as she whispered urgently for him to sit, her voice sharp but her eyes betraying a torrent of emotions. She could no longer disguise a mix of fear, pride, and disbelief. But Louis didn't budge. He stood taller, his small fists clenched at his sides, his jaw set as though daring anyone to contradict him. Even William, visibly caught off guard, seemed unsure whether to intervene or let his son finish what he had begun. Camilla, meanwhile, stood frozen, her composure cracked in an instant. The calculated grace she had worn like armor all evening was gone, replaced with a stunned expression that betrayed both fury and humiliation. For the first time in memory, she had no words. Her lips parted, but no sound came. The sharpness that had carried her through years of conflict and controversy had vanished under the weight of Louis's simple, piercing declaration. Cameras captured every flicker of emotion across the royals' faces, every whispered gasp from the crowd, every look of disbelief that passed from guest to guest. And as the room erupted into a quiet storm of whispers and speculation, a single truth began to spread like wildfire. The youngest prince had just exposed the fault lines in the monarchy for all to see. But Louis wasn't finished. What he did next would take the shock to an entirely different level. With the audacity of a prince and the heart of a son, Louis turned the tables on the monarchy itself, leaving even William and Charles speechless. After his explosive declaration from the table, he didn't retreat into silence or embarrassment. Instead, he climbed down from his chair with a resolve that seemed to grow heavier with each step. The stunned quiet of the room only sharpened the sound of his shoes against the floor, each strike of leather against marble echoing like a drumbeat of defiance. Eyes followed him now, not with pity, not with indulgence, but with awe, confusion, and fear. He walked toward the podium with a determination that drew gasps. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the microphone, but his grip was steady when he raised it to speak. And when his voice came, though small at first, it carried across the room with piercing clarity, silencing even the murmurs that had begun to bubble around him. "You're trying to erase her," he said, his words directed squarely at Camilla, his young face tight with fury. "You're trying to pretend my mother doesn't belong in this family's story. But we see you. I see you. And it ends tonight." The room erupted not with applause this time, but with low, stunned murmurs, a collective intake of breath at the audacity of his accusation. Guests shifted in their chairs, some rising to their feet instinctively, unsure whether to intervene or bear witness. A few even nodded quietly, as though this small prince had just spoken the words they themselves had been too afraid to utter. Catherine, seated just behind him, raised her hands to her face, hiding her reaction. But through her fingers, one could glimpse her tearful eyes, torn between pride in her son's courage and the gnawing fear of what this public spectacle might mean for him and for her. William stood rigid at the table, his jaw set, his eyes dark, exchanging a loaded glance with Charles that spoke volumes of the turmoil now boiling to the surface. The air in the room seemed to thicken with every heartbeat, tension wound tighter with each passing second. Louis did not falter. His gaze remained fixed, his words deliberate, each one delivered like a blade to the carefully constructed façade Camilla had worn all evening. For the first time in her reign of quiet manipulation, she stood truly stripped of composure, her silence louder than any protest she might have offered. And in that silence, the smallest royal, barely tall enough to see over the podium, proved himself more fearless than anyone else in the room. Yet even as chaos began to brew around him, Louis stood his ground and delivered the final blow that no one could undo. Louis's final words didn't just stun Camilla, they cracked open the deepest secrets of the royal family for the world to see. Standing firm before the hushed crowd, his small figure radiated defiance as he lifted his voice once more. This time, louder, steadier. "The people deserve the truth," he declared, his gaze sweeping across the room before landing back on Camilla. "You are a pretender to the crown, and everyone here knows it. My mother is their queen, and nothing you say can change that." The words dropped like stones into water, sending ripples through the assembly that could not be undone. Gasps erupted from every corner of the hall, sharp and audible, slicing through the tense quiet. Some guests instinctively placed hands over their mouths, their eyes wide with disbelief. A few, emboldened by his audacity, even began to clap soft at first, hesitant but real, while others recoiled in horror, casting panicked glances at one another as if the very ceiling might collapse. Every pair of eyes shifted from Louis to Camilla, searching her face for a reaction. Camilla, though visibly rattled, attempted to regain her composure. She straightened her back and lifted her chin as though to dismiss the boy's accusations with the cool authority she had long perfected. But as she opened her mouth to speak, Louis cut her off with nothing more than a single, unblinking stare. And something in that look of quiet, unshakable certainty stole the words from her throat before they could form. For the first time, Camilla appeared powerless. Her lips trembled, her eyes shimmered with unspent rage, and tears betrayed her carefully constructed facade. The press photographers, sensing history in the making, worked feverishly. Cameras clicked furiously as her tear-streaked, furious face was frozen forever, immortalized in frame after frame that would soon circle the globe. Each flash seemed to expose her further, illuminating the cracks in her armor until she could no longer hide behind them. William, unable to stay seated any longer, stepped forward at last, his hand outstretched as though to usher Louis away and restore some semblance of control. But before he could reach his son, Catherine's quiet hand caught his sleeve. Her eyes, wet but resolute, held his. There was no need to speak, he understood. This was not the moment to silence their son. Not anymore. With a final breath, Louis turned from Camilla, facing the stunned audience instead. His defiance softened into something almost regal as he bowed low, a gesture of humility and power all at once. And then, like a storm breaking into sunlight, the room erupted. A standing ovation rose around him, hesitant at first, but then thunderous, unstoppable. Some clapped with tears in their eyes, others with cautious admiration, but no one could deny it anymore. The crown itself had been called into question. But as the ovation faded, the consequences of Louis's bold defiance began to take shape, and they would be devastating. When the doors of the charity hall closed, whispers turned into shouts behind palace walls, and the royal family stood on the brink of open war. The ovation that had followed Louis's bow still echoed faintly in the air outside, but within the inner sanctum of the monarchy, applause gave way to chaos. Camilla stormed out of the hall first, flanked by aides who scrambled to keep pace with her, their faces pale at the venom in her expression. Her humiliation hung in the air like smoke, choking, heavy, impossible to ignore, and her heels struck the marble floor like a warning to everyone in her path. Catherine sank to one knee, gathering Louis into her arms, her lips brushing his ear as she whispered something no one else could hear. Tears streaked her cheeks now without shame, her fingers gripping him tight as though both grateful and terrified of what his defiance had unleashed. Across the room, William and Charles disappeared through a side door into a private chamber, but the sound of their raised voices still reached those who lingered nearby. Their argument, fierce and cutting, bled through the walls as though the palace itself could no longer contain it. Outside, the media frenzy had already begun. Reporters spoke into cameras with wide-eyed urgency, their voices rising above the din of car engines and crowd chatter. Prince Louis defies Queen Consort, monarchy in turmoil, unprecedented royal scandal. The headlines were already writing themselves faster than anyone inside could contain the story. The boy who stood up, some called him. The rebellion of innocence, others dared to say. And still, there were murmurs of anger, whispers of betrayal, suggestions that Louis's actions had broken an unspoken code no heir had ever dared challenge. Senior courtiers huddled in corners of the palace, their faces grim as they made frantic calls to manage the unfolding disaster. Some spoke of damage control, others of punishment, while a few even murmured about sending Louis away until the storm passed. Every possibility of exile, apology, silence was discussed in panicked, breathless tones, as though the very foundation of the monarchy depended on what came next. And then came the quietest yet most chilling revelation of all. Several staff members claimed Camilla, through gritted teeth and tear-streaked cheeks, had whispered a threat as she left, that if they wanted war, she would give them war, and she would bring with her the family secrets no one dared to speak aloud. And just when the palace thought the worst had passed, an anonymous tip to the press promised an even darker revelation to come. The world would remember that night as the beginning of the end for one reign and the unexpected rise of a prince who refused to bow. As dawn broke over London, the monarchy awoke to a reality it could no longer control. Across newspapers, television screens, and glowing phones in every corner of the globe, Prince Louis's rebellion dominated every headline. Social media flooded with his image, his words quoted endlessly, his defiance dissected and celebrated. He was hailed as the boy who stood up for his mother, a phrase that trended worldwide before the palace had even drafted its first response. Public opinion shifted overnight with a force no one inside the palace had anticipated. For years, the royal family had relied on carefully curated appearances to sway hearts. But here was something raw, unpolished, and utterly impossible to spin. Millions declared their support for Louis and Catherine, their posts and voices drowning out the murmur of palace-approved statements. In cafes and markets, at bus stops and in boardrooms, ordinary people spoke his name like a rallying cry, their admiration for his courage surpassing any lingering loyalty to the institution he had challenged. And in the silence that followed, Camilla vanished from sight. Official statements claimed she was resting, but rumors painted a much darker picture. Whispers that she had retreated in disgrace, unable to face the public after being so publicly undone by a child she underestimated. Some said she had demanded exile for Louis. Others insisted she was plotting her revenge. But one thing was certain. Her absence left a vacuum no one could quite fill. Inside Buckingham Palace, the mood was far from celebratory. Behind the gilded doors, secret meetings were convened late into the night. Courtiers debated whether Louis should be punished or protected. Opinions clashed in raised voices, echoing through empty corridors, while William and Catherine remained notably absent from those conversations. William reportedly paced the floors in silence, while Catherine refused to entertain any suggestion of punishing her son, insisting to all who would listen that he had spoken from his heart, not as part of some calculated plan, but from the pure, unshakable love of a son for his mother. Yet no matter how much they tried to frame it, the monarchy had been changed forever. Even among its own walls, cracks began to widen. Louis's defiance became more than just a scandal. It became a symbol. His boldness lit a quiet fire in those who had long questioned the hierarchy, his refusal to bow casting doubt on traditions once held sacred. It foreshadowed a future where battles would no longer be fought in whispers and back rooms, but in full view of the world. And so, as the dust settled over Buckingham Palace, and the world speculated on what came next, one truth became undeniable. Nothing in the royal family would ever be the same again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.